Sorry.
I need the mayor's gavel.
Okay.
But the next big topic we have coming up is our water wells. And so to kind of set the stage for this, Chris will walk you through all this, but the city operates 3 water wells. Chris, those 3 wells are all 50 so years old.
50 plus years
50
old.
plus years old. He will be telling you that the study that we've recently had done, you know, they estimated 30-year life, so we've certainly gotten, now I will tell you these wells have had some rehab done to them over time, but we're still using those 3 wells that are 50 plus years old. So as you take into consideration this is not there is cost absolutely associated with new wells, and it is a significant cost, but the cost of there's also a cost to doing nothing. If we do not consider replacing these wells, that water has to come from somewhere, and the somewhere is TRA. And so he will talk about the cost of the water that we get from the wells, and then he'll talk about what it costs us to buy water from TRA. So, you know, the simple answer here is not just, well, as they die, we'll let them go, because then we have to replace that water, and we have to purchase that water from TRA. So you have to look at what does it cost to get it from TRA, and what does it cost to do new wells. So we're going to walk you through this and kind of set the stage for what the consultant's report has revealed and what our recommendation would be, and then we'll talk about how we can pay for that. So
Last year, y'all remember, we talked a little bit about commission of the wells, and we had a budget request that you authorized for a study. And Loretta said we just got that study back, which we have. So I want to kind of tell you what we found out from all that, but I also want to give you a quick little rundown of our system, because it just helps this all make sense in your mind. So we have 3 well sites where there is a groundwater well. We have 3 sites where there is an elevated storage tank, or your typical water tower that you're used to seeing. Those are not in every instance the same site. So if we start at the bottom of the city at the Cullum Water Tower, that is the water tower. It's a 2 million gallon water tower next to Heritage Park and the museum. That's the newest water tower. It's the one that's got Home of Texas Star painted on it. And there is not a water well there. So that's the yellow pin. It is just a 2 million gallon elevated storage tank. Moving north, when you move across 183.
Wait for it.
Right behind the Sonic is what we call the Fuller well. And that is a well site. There is no elevated storage tank. There is a ground storage tank there, but not an elevated water tower. That is just a well site. Moving further north at what we call the North Main well, that's the one location where there is a well and a elevated storage tank on the same piece of property. That's the leg stand tank that we painted a few years back and put Home of the Trinity Trojans on the bottom of it, kind of across from, that's the Church of Christ, I guess, right there, and the Mormon church right there on Main Street. Moving even further north, crossing over Mid-Cities Boulevard, just past Bear Creek Drive, there is what we call the Far North well. That is a ground well with a ground storage tank, a 500,000 gallon ground storage tank on that property. And then the very furthest one is what we call the North Main water tower. That's the other 2 million gallon water tower with the column based. We've got the one leg tower that has the 4 individual legs. The other 2 towers are what we call column tower. So if we're talking just about wells, which we're going to kind of do, we tend to talk about as Fuller, North Main, and Far North. It took us a long time to come up with those names. So I've always thought that was funny, but that's what they were named when I came to work here. So that's what we're going with. Again, the Fuller well, just to orient you, it's right there behind Sonic. Several years back, we had the opportunity to buy a dilapidated property right there that fronts Fuller Drive and tear down an old frame house, and we were able to do that, and that made that site a little bit easier to access. And it's going to be very key now, because what this study is going to come back and tell you is that we have the ability, based on space, to re-drill a new well at that same site. So you're not having to acquire a new piece of property that's cheaper, and although not only is the well 50 plus years old, most of the equipment's pretty old too, but there is some of that you get an economy of savings. For instance, that ground storage tank's in great condition, well kept up. So it's obviously nice to re-drill something on the same site where you have some infrastructure already in place.
This well has
I'm sorry?
become one of our most problematic wells, though. It really is, there's no doubt, nearing the end of its life.
This is the one that we have told you that we're getting water from upper aquifers. So we're getting Glenrose and Biloxi aquifer water draining down into our Trinity well. The water is not, I mean, it's drinkable, it's of high quality. It has taste and odor and most notably iron. So you get some iron stains. If you go down there around Ash and Oak, where a lot of those large properties still have their own dill turns, still has its own well, you'll see all that iron staining on their buildings and even their trees. And I mean, that's just because those upper aquifers have a high iron content. So this is the one, if you remember that, instead of, we've had to change how we operate it. It's currently down. It was the one that was hit by lightning that we're having to replace. But what would happen is when the well shut off, that upper aquifer water would drain down the shaft. And when I use the word contaminate, it's not bad. I mean, it would pool at the bottom of the well. And when the well kicked back on, you'd get a high concentration of that upper aquifer water sucked up through the well. So probably a year and a half ago, we changed the operation of that. We run it at a much lower RPM and efficiency so that it runs more continually, so that you're always taking a little bit of water from the bottom and so that you don't get that higher concentration. It's not the most peak efficient way to operate the well, but it serves us okay in this case. But when we start talking about re-drilling, this would be ground zero. This is where we start.
I have noticed, I don't know about anybody else, but I don't know whether or not it's people's perceptions or whatever, but I've received so few complaints about the smell of water. In my house, I really, you really don't have a problem in your area.
Got the best of the city in our area.
There you go. Just like when I was in Wilshire, our water, I never had an issue there, but, it's gotten a lot better, so.
It's because two of the wells have been offline for us.
I knew there was some sort of,
That's-
okay.
Now, it's interesting, we haven't heard it here because we're Trinity River Authority, but there's been a lot of articles in Arlington where people are complaining about taste and odor.
Yep.
And it is seasonal algae blooms. Again, it's not a health issue, it's just,
Right.
it's a taste and odor deal. And it's water out of Lake Arlington. And you say, well, we get our water out of Lake Arlington too from TRA. How come we're not having the same thing? TRA has got all this advanced treatment that y'all through the plant, you've seen that.
Yep.
Arlington has that at one of their treatment plants, but not the other. And the one that has it is right now closed for a planned renovation.
Oh,
And so they're running it through the other one. And so this time of the year, there's been several newspaper articles about it, but that's, even though we're getting from the same source, TRA is doing some additional treatment, so.
good to know.
This next site is, again, that's just the lake sand site where there's a well and a tower. This is the only site there at the north main well. This one, and it's kind of obvious, if you can see the picture better, it'd be more obvious. It's just too small of a site to re-drill the well. Now, the lucky part for us is that is our best well of the three wells that we have right now. It's the most consistent, it's the one that is just, it's in the best shape. So we cannot re-drill it on that property, but it's still 50 plus years old. It's still past the end of life, but of the three, it's the best one. And then this is that North Main, the far North Main ground storage site. Again, what the report has told us is it is a large enough piece of property to be able to re-drill the well and reuse most of the equipment that is already present there, including that ground storage tank. This is that North Main water tower 2 mil. This is the furthest north. What is that court, Bob? Is that
That's Almond.
Almond Court there, just
Yeah,
to the
just
right of the
behind
picture? So Main Street and Cinnamon, the Nut Streets right there. Spice Street, sorry. Nut Streets. Gary Landers used to live in that area, so sometimes the association that comes out. There's no well at this site right now. However, I told you we could not re-drill a well at the lake tank. This would be probably the spot to, when we re-drill a well, to move here. We would have to do some additional testing, including a test well, before you sink the kind of money into a new municipal well. But there is room here to do a test well, and there's some operation efficiency where we can use that well then to fill that tank. You've noticed at the other well sites, you've either got an elevated storage tank or ground storage tanks. It's part of the operation of the well. So it would be the logical spot to be able to re-drill that third well. So what did the report tell us? The report told us that it's going to be about $3.5 to $4 million per well site.
Wow.
All in for a new well. We had told you, I think last year or so when we were looking at this, that we had checked around and we were seeing in the neighborhood of around $2.5 million to drill a new well. When I show you kind of the report, that has stayed true. Well, you say, well, what's the difference? Well, the difference is the all-in part. You've got to thoroughly and by law cap and plug the existing well. And then there's all kinds of things that we would do beyond drilling the well when we did at this site. You'll remember that we've got an exception right now from TCEQ on their blending exception. When we drill new wells, it would obviously be the time, in my mind, to go in and add that additional disinfection process that would allow us to not have to have this blending exception. Nobody at TCEQ can or will tell us how long they will continue to grant that exception. So this will be the time to address that. If you didn't put in the equipment, at least put in the infrastructure and the ability to then plug a piece of equipment in line, if you will, when you're ready.
Which, Chris, that then would help with the taste and odor issues from the water from those wells being blended with the TRA water. So right now, we've been granted the exception because of our wells are very old, but if we're putting in new ones, we would need to put in the proper equipment to allow that blending. And you've heard Hal and his folks talk about that would then help to alleviate some of the taste and odor complaints.
In addition, and I'll just show you, I think I have to tell you about it. This is a little chart from the draft report where you're up at the top, you've got the 3 wells that I told you about. The one that says 2 mil, that is if we moved it to that new site. You will notice that it's got a higher cost because the cost of a test well, a preliminary test well at that site is included in that one. There is no preliminary test well in the Fuller and Far North because they're existing well sites. There's no reason to do a test well. So at the second line down, you'll see construction of a new well, carbon steel, and then an alternate construction of a new well, stainless steel. What they're talking about is the casing that goes into the ground, in these cases, some 1,700 foot width of casing. Stainless steel, I'll go back to carbon. Carbon steel is the typical material that is used in wells. It's fine, there's not a problem. Stainless steel is just a better material. It does not get as brittle over time. The brittle can be what causes, like we have now, where you get the upper aquifer leaks into the casing. If I showed you a video of our wells now, a down the shaft video, you would see any number of patches that have been put in that existing casing over the years. It's a swedged patch. It's somewhat like patching a pair of jeans. The first one's okay, and then when I was a kid, I had patches on top of patches in my knees, and at some point in time, you just say, well, our wells are at that point in time.
You just turn them into shorts.
So, a decision hasn't been made, but I would tell you, I would want to look very hard at the cost of a stainless steel well versus the carbon steel as we look through it. But you'll even see in here that sound barrier. That sound barrier is like when they used to drill gas wells everywhere. That's pricing for putting up sound barrier at those sites. If you saw them, they're in most cases in residential areas. So when you start drilling a well, it's kind of like drilling a gas well. They turn it on and they drill till they get to the bottom. It may be measured in days, not hours. So, I mean, that's how detailed this is we were proposing sound protection. This obviously is all new pumps. We would be going to a variable frequency drive pump. Mr. Zimmer explained that better than I can, but instead of just an on or off, a variable frequency drive ramps up and ramps down to your load, so it's more efficient, has a longer life pump. Obviously, I have to rework the electrical These well sites have, you'll see that booster pump, they have booster pumps there. We do not bring the water out of the ground at the pressure that is needed to supply through the system. So when it goes out into the system, these booster pumps have to put it up to system-wide pressure. They need to be replaced as well. I'm saying all that to say, the reason we went from 2.5 to say 3.5 or $4 million is because we're not talking about just drilling the well now. This is kind of the whole package of what you would have to have at those sites, including disinfection, SCADA, et cetera. You can see an engineering and contingency estimate in there. What it all comes down to is this bottom piece. In a carbon steel scenario, you're somewhere between 51 and 56 cents per 1,000 gallons cost. Okay, so to drill this well, and they're getting that number on a 30-year loan, which again, we can debate whether 30-year, 20-year, 25. Janina and Loretta would tell you we typically don't do 30-year money because many times it's not a 30-year asset. I think it's worth talking about here because our existing wells are more than 50 years old. But obviously, if you want to change that to 20-year number, it's just going to manipulate that number a little bit.
They're really here trying to get you apples to apples with TRA on the, what is it costing? And they're saying this well is going to have at least a 30-year life. And then they're looking at its presumed production, and then they're converting that into a cost per 1,000 gallons so that we can bank this against our TRA. And then how we choose to finance it would be obviously different, but this is, so you can do an apples to apples comparison of the cost of water from a well. And this next slide will bring this into, go ahead and go to your next slide so you can see.
That bottom number there, you can see the difference if you went to stainless steel. And then the next slide that Loretta referred to up there at the top, now they're going to add in the operational cost. And I'm going to tell you, we currently have operational costs. This is how they're getting back to, as Loretta said, a comparison to a TRA number. So if you look at the electrical, we've assumed, we know what the electrical is, we know what our electric rate is, at least for the next 5 years because we're locked in. Disinfection, that pump replacement, you can see what they factored in there. All comes down to between 57 and 53 cents per thousand. So you add that together and you get down to this statement, which is, if we're talking about carbon steel, $1.07 to $1.09 is the cost per 1,000 gallons, all in. If you go to stainless steel, it's $1.19 to $1.20. The apples to apples comparison is our current rate from TRA is $3.27. We also know that our TRA rate is never, I shouldn't say never, it's not going down in the foreseeable future. If you look at their projections, it goes up. Electrical cost to get water, raw water, treatment. I would not ever tell you to bank on that number going down. So
this was really kind of, from the staff's perspective, the first decision point of, do we stay in the well business? And does it make sense, or should we just, when the wells die, plug them and go to TRA water? And I would tell you that we started into this process with maybe some thinking, well, maybe we should just not have the wells. But when you look at this, that and roughly now in optimal situation, we would be getting about 1 million gallons per day from each of the wells, Chris. So you got the potential there. Now, I will tell you, with the wells being up and down the way they've been, we have not been at that optimal production for quite some time. So if you're not able to get that water from the well, you've got to go purchase it from TRA. So then when you do the math on that at the $3.27 per 1,000 gallons, we quickly made a decision that the wells continue to make sense from a financial perspective.
It's over $2 a gallon savings.
Yeah. So, and again, if they all quit tomorrow, we
It's
have
not
to
price.
purchase that water. So that has got, right now when we do our budget, we count on getting the water from the wells at a cheaper cost, and that's factored in. Obviously, our customers are not paying for well water and TRA water. It's a blended rate, but we're able to keep the overall rate lower, our overall cost lower, because there is some supplement from well water as well.
Well, that's 3 million gallons a day. Is that what you said, 3 million a day? 3 million?
That's optimal.
Optimal. What would that represent of our total consumption? It's a small part, right?
well, if there are a couple ways to answer that. The 365-day average consumption in the city of Euless is 6.5 million gallons of water. So 3 million gallons would basically happen. But A peak day is 20 million gallons of water. We're not getting the 3 million right now. So the way I'd really answer that question is when I go back and look at a given calendar year, we are about 70% TRA, 30% well water. This gets into kind of the next part of this, and you kind of have to follow along the train of thought here. We are a member of Trinity River Authority, along with the 4 other cities. We have a contractual obligation with them. There is nowhere in that contract that says the city of Euless cannot produce more than X gallons or has to produce Y gallons. It is, I don't like the term gentleman's agreement, but when that cooperative was put together, we all, as individual cities, brought to the table a certain amount of existing water. And as a cooperative, we've added to TRA and grown the plant over time. So if I went out and drilled wells all over the place because you said, Chris, it's a third of the cost of Duro well water, the heck with TRA, let's just go do it. That would be to absolutely the detriment of TRA and to all of our neighboring sister TRA cities. I wouldn't want to do that to them. I don't want Colleyville, Bedford, Grapevine to do that to us. So we all hold each other's hands, if you will. So the way that this is typically looked at is our 3 wells that we came to the table with, whether they're doing it today or not is inconsequential. They were 1 MGD wells. So 3 million gallons, I look at it as our basket. To replace, by drilling new wells, that 3 million gallons or 3.5 or somewhere in that neighborhood is absolutely fine and appropriate, I guess. But to go in and say, let's drill enough wells to take care of 100% of our need, I think would cause us legal trouble, besides not just being the right thing to do to the community. So when we look at that, this is going to get into our recommendation. Obviously, those other wells are old. We drill a new well. The hydraulic study would show that by altering the size of the pumps and motors and shafts, that the long story short is I could get 3 million gallons a day out of 2 new wells, not out of 3 new wells. So where we've kind of landed as a staff at this point, and we seek a little direction from you, is we would not recommend re-drilling all 3 sites. We would recommend doing a project to re-drill 2 sites, that being Fuller and Far North. We kind of, and Loretta's talk more about this later, we kind of see it as a single project, but you would drill these wells sequentially. So we'd start with Fuller, take it offline. We would leave Far North and the 1 mill site up and running, and we would do everything that was drilling and putting Fuller back online. And when you turned it on, then you'd move over to Far North, take Far North offline. So we're never just completely offline. What we would recommend is doing that at Fuller, doing it at Far North, and leaving the 1 mill well site alone. I told you earlier it's the best of the 3 old ones, but it's also the one that we can't re-drill at that site that would cause us to move, that would cause us to do a test well, and those type of things. So on one hand, if we go down to 2 wells that give us the same amount of gallonage that we're kind of grandfathered to from 3 wells, from a gallon standpoint, you feel pretty good. But maybe going back to your emergency operations plan, now you're relying on 2 spots instead of 3 spots. I think what we were recommending is that we do these 2 new ones, and you would be relying on those 2, but you'd leave that 1 mill old spot, old well up and running, and you'd run that sucker till it got like Fuller, where we're getting upper aquifer issues. Even if that meant you need to replace the pump in a couple of years or something, we would just run that until a point in time when it no longer made sense, and then we would pursue as a separate project moving up to the 2 million gallon elevated storage tank up north, doing a test well. So I guess what I'm saying is I would see in a long-term horizon always having 3 wells and still having 3 wells, but kind of 2 programs, a 2-well program now and a potential 3rd well program at some point in time in the future. Obviously, that's going to lower the cost. When we talk about $3.5 to $4 million a well, now we're talking about $7 or $8 million instead of $12, $13 million. So I think that's one thing. I also want to step back real quick, and Loretta, if this doesn't come out right, you help me. when you get this $1.19, $1.20, that is your true apples to apples number to look at from buying water from TRA. Set that over here. On the other side is, if we did this project, it's going to have an effect to our water rate, because we're going to potentially sell debt, and we're gonna have to pay for that debt, and the way you pay for the debt is through the rate. So the next obvious question is, okay, Chris, if you do this project, what is the effect on the existing rate? We're going to tell you that number is approximately 30 cents, I think is what we've calculated, on the existing rate. On one hand, I mean, again, you start to look at the $1.20 versus 3. You might say, well, Chris, these numbers are more than 30 cents per thousand. How do you get that? When I'm talking 30 cents per thousand, remember, this is just the well water. 30 cents per thousand on the rate is our total usage, TRA and city. So that's why that number
So,
goes down.
and the operational cost for the most part is in our budget now. So really, then that's where, this is your apples to apples comparison. Then we step back and we say, if you were to issue either $6.5 million for carbon steel or $8 million in debt for stainless steel, and then what is the debt service on that? And on a 20-year debt, which is what we typically issue, then that is about 80,000. $1 million is a ballpark number for that. So then we crank that into our total consumption citywide from all water usage. And if you did it all from a volume charge and none from a base rate, that's where I get to about your 30 cents per thousand. Of course, you go back to the doing nothing piece. If you do nothing, you've got to crank something in your rates to pay for that $3.27 from TRA. So that's where I'm saying the direct impact. Now, and then we could, as you all would have a decision point as to whether or not you want to do a longer life debt. I think the whole point of us always trying to do like a 20-year debt is you do not want to be paying debt on an asset that has ended its life before the debt's paid off. In this case, could be something we would look at. We would want to explore two options here: Texas water development, low interest financing, potentially even some grant money through that. That would absolutely be our first choice, which could even bring that cost down even more. But in the event that we did not qualify for that, then there would be revenue bonds. All of the debt, our water and sewer fund has very little debt. The debt that it has right now is being paid for by the impact fee. That pays off in 2020, so we don't have any debt fall off. There's not a lot of debt in the water system, but this would be debt that would be secured by the revenue of the water and sewer fund, and then you have to have a commitment in your rate to pay for that debt. So that is our best guess today, and then we would explore, he can walk you through the timelines of how we would need to apply for low interest financing from Texas Water Development Board, but then our backup to that would always be the ability to issue the revenue bonds secured by the rates if we were not successful in getting that funding. So.
There's two little tricky pieces to this as well. The wells are permitted through the TCEQ, so we've got to go TCEQ and get authority, if you will. Now, we feel that that's a pretty low hurdle because we are replacing existing wells, but you still got to go through the process, and sometimes that can be interesting. The second piece is, oh gosh, in the last 5 or 6 years, statewide, they've done these water conservation districts. We did one here. It's a Trinity Regional Water Conservation District that we are a member of. We have to be a member of. It was statutorily created, and that is the folks that charge us a little bit. It goes already into our rate for groundwater conservation, and they do projects. They are also the ones that, on a local level, are authorized by the state to control well drilling and regulations and rules. They are currently operating under a set of temporary rules that it's pretty easy to pull them out and read and understand how that would affect our project. They are working to adopt a set of permanent rules that the best they will tell you is they hope to have those adopted by 2018. And when we say to them, well, how do you see these rules differing from your current temporary rules? They'll say, we're not sure yet. So one thing we're going to have to do, no matter what, even to be honest with you, whether we decided to not do anything, we just keep running on our existing wells, short of just completely getting out of the well business, we're going to have to be really involved, and we've been attending those meetings, but we're going to have to get really involved and be a stakeholder in that rulemaking process to fully understand that.
are supplementing that, and it's good to have a backup source. But we cannot do it at the detriment of TRA, who is our primary supplier and will always be our primary supplier. Now, they will look at the case of our reclaimed water, they did not balk at that, because it does, because of the growth in the community, allow there to be a delay in system expansion, which is very costly, so they did not balk at that. And, could we go to 3.5 million, or, if our pumps were working really well? If we determine that we need all 3 wells, but perhaps 1 million gallons per day is not the optimal, but maybe 750,000, I think we could do all of that, but I think there's a range in there, but I think you get to a point at which you are hurting your other co-op cities, because you are, we are not on a take or pay. Some systems work on a take or pay. You say what you're going to take, and whether you take it or whether you don't, you pay for it. We're very fortunate with TRA that we don't have that. We each say at the beginning of the year, this is what we expect to take from your system. And Euless has always been typically very close to that. But if you miss that number, that's what we've talked to you about in the past, they set their rate based on what we all commit to take. And if we miss that number significantly, or we alter that number significantly, then they have a fixed amount of cost. There is a variable component to their rate, but they have a lot of fixed costs. The debt service on the plant, that's not changing no matter what volume we take. And so it affects the rate, and that's where we get these refunds, or we get these bills at the end of the year, is based on people taking what they said they would take. So I think that we would, as Chris called it, the gentleman's agreement, we would try and stay in that 3 million gallon per day range, because we are all also hitting it on our reclaimed water system. Our take from that now, or what it will ultimately be, is 200 and something.
We've already used
million.
140 million gallons,
Yeah.
just actual use before in a given year, so it continues to grow. It'll be over 200 million.
So, could it fluctuate slightly? I think it could, but I don't think we would want to go to 4.5 million and considerably per day and considerably impact that, because those fixed costs are ours and the other 4 cities to bear regardless.
I'm missing something in my understanding. It sounds like if we do nothing, we save our citizens 30 cents. If we drill the 2 wells, we add 30 cents.
If you
Why
do
don't we
nothing, you'll save your citizens the 30 cents until the 3 wells die. When the 3 wells die, the 1 million gallons per day that we are currently producing for $1 and whatever that was, 15 cents or 20 cents, you have to replace it. How do you replace
That's what
it? You
it jumps.
purchase it from TRA, and you purchase
from
it
then
from
on.
TRA for $3.27. So we will have to take those gallons at $2.07 more per 1,000 gallons, factor that into our rate, and distribute that out to all the customers. And so they are going to experience a rate increase because
60 cents net.
because we will no longer have that dollar water.
So over the
to
30
blend in the
years,
rate.
the citizens are better off if
So-
we drill 2 wells.
Yes, if we could just keep these wells going forever the way they are today, we could save the 30 cents and everybody would be great. But when those wells die, we have to buy that water from TRA. And we know the cost of that today is $3.27, and they have been going up at a considerably higher rate each year, so.
They
looking
haven't
out-
set this year's rate request yet, but last year it was projected 20 cents for 2018.
So,
Now, that is, everything she said is absolutely right. What I'm gonna call that is the business argument. The other side of this that in my mind supports it is, if you just said today, well, let's shut the wells and go all TRA, not only do you have the business side of the argument she has made, but then we have no redundancy or backup. If TRA has a plant issue or a water supply issue, we're just kind of all looking at each other. We have interconnection with Collegeville and Bedford, but they are TRA cities. We have interconnection with Grapevine, who is half TRA and half Lake Grapevine. But if we had a problem at the TRA plant and Grapevine's out of their TRA water, they're not giving me any Lake Grapevine water. They need it all for themselves. So that's, besides the business and the numbers argument, there's the all your eggs in one basket, I think, that we try
this
to
kind
stay
of
away
goes to
from
the
too.
emergency planning side that Ms. Bynum was talking to. at the 3 million gallons per day, we would not be able to allow everyone to do what they typically do, but you could have at least some basic water service if TRA were to go completely offline for some catastrophic reason. We could provide some basic, at least fire protection service and some basic drinking water type. I mean, we would certainly be in a curtailment, but we would not be at zero. So that is a very valid point.
And a little side note, just to tie that in, we've talked to you in the past and we'll continue to talk to you about the Fort Worth interconnect. That is the idea of having an emergency connection out at the Riverwalk area of our town to there's a 24-inch line from Fort Worth that goes to DFW Airport. That is a completely different source of water than TRA, at least from the plant. So in the case where TRA, if something catastrophic happens and we drop down to just our wells, which might be 3, it would also be nice to be able to go turn on that Fort Worth interconnect to supplement that 3, and maybe that 3 becomes, 4 million. It won't be a lot, but it would be nice to have that. Because you could curtail. If our average day is 6 million, you tell people we're in a little bit of emergency, don't water, don't wash, use, I think you could, but if you're on an August day where it's 21 million, getting down to 3's a lot harder.
Where we are on that Fort Worth interconnect is that we provide some service to Fort Worth in the southern part of town, and I believe that's from the sewer standpoint, not the water side. But they have customers that they cannot service from their system, and the city of Euless has serviced those customers, and it's basically a straight pass-through. Fort Worth pays us for that service, so they don't have to put in the infrastructure to service those folks. And it's really basically they're south of Pipeline, or south of South Pipeline Road. Chris has talked with Fort Worth about this interconnect, and there is a cost of the infrastructure to make the connection, which we certainly would expect to need to bear if we get this connection. But then they also have what they will charge other cities is like kind of a monthly,
It's a connection fee.
I guess you call it an access
It's a little bit
fee.
like a base charge.
The right to access. And so Chris has made the argument to them that, we're fine paying the infrastructure cost for the connection, but it was a pretty exorbitant, if I recall.
$43,000.
Yeah, access fee, just to have the right to turn the switch on if we need it, seems inconsistent with the fact that we have provided your customer service for years, and we don't charge you a surcharge for that.
But I
We
could
just do it.
adopt a $43,000 access sewer charge if you'd let me.
So we are right now requesting that they consider waiving that fee for us, and they've not been willing to do that yet. That's why we've not moved forward. But our argument to them is that they're saying, well, if we waive it for you, we have to waive it for others. And we're saying, no, we provide your citizens with service to save you the millions of dollars it would cost you to extend your line. And so we would like you to consider that for us. We have not been successful so far, so we'll
It's a
continue.
reciprocal access arrangement.
Yes,
Yes.
that's exactly what we see it as, so. But we'll continue to.
Right now, it's half of the reciprocal access agreement.
So we will continue to work with the staff and we'll see if we can make any headway with that, but
Chris, my only question on this is there any warranty on this? Is it warranted for 5 years or anything like that? or-
Here's the best part. If you want to start a business in retirement, start a well business. No one, there's warranty on a pump, and component type stuff. Drilling a well, no one will warranty. And I guess it's always frustrating me, but they're working in a 16 or 18-inch hole, 1,700 feet deep in the earth. I feel more confident here because we're moving over, I think it's like 50 feet from the well that we've had for years, and so we're going back to the same aquifer. It's not like we're not gonna hit water, I guess is what I'm
Do you
saying.
go deeper so that sediment kicks in or whatever? I don't know this business, but do you go deeper than you are now? So
We
that
actually would
20
really be
years-
at almost the exact same
Okay.
depth. I'm trying to think of the best way. I used to think of a well as like a glass. Like this is the surface and here's the water, and I just put a straw and drink it, and there's this massive cavern
Okay.
down there with water. It's not, it's really more like this glass with a sponge in it. And the water's in the sponge, and you drill down through that, and the suction brings the water through. So what we do is our wells are in the 1,800-foot depth range. The pump is set at, give or take, 1,400 feet, but the water table level is at 800 feet. So think about this pump being well underneath the water level. And it's positioned there so that when the well kicks on, there's a drawdown of the water. So there's kind of an inverted tone. But it's also positioned there that so over time, that aquifer depth, that you don't end up with a dry well is kind of where I'm getting at.
Right.
So Groundwater Conservation District, maybe this is what they did with some of our 8 cents, Mr. Bynum. The state has always kind of monitored aquifer levels. So you hear about Edwards Aquifer in San Antonio, and years ago it was dropping, so they did all these new rules, right? Well, the Trinity Aquifer is not really dropping, or it's dropping so small up here that nobody's too, they monitor it, but it's not a huge drop. So really, there's not a significant difference in water elevation in that Trinity Aquifer from when the wells were drilled to today. So we don't really go deeper, it doesn't really help you any.
Okay.
And I think you were asking about, so you don't get the problem. The problem that we were having at the Fuller well was not from that aquifer. It was because of I'm not technical, Chris, you explain it, but an erosion in the casing that's allowing water to come in from a higher aquifer that you want to keep out. And so a new well's casing would not have that issue. You talked about the patches.
And over the years, Mr. Tompkins, we've played every trick you can play. So when you first start getting that, you go patch the casing like we talked about earlier. And when you get too many patches, you don't actually cut it into shorts. You actually go outside of that casing in pressurized grout, trying to seal the outside. You can then, and we've already done this trick too, you can go into what used to be a 16-inch casing and put in a smaller, say 12-inch casing. So the water's still coming in, but it's reduced. I mean, we have played all those tricks, and that's why we say the life of the well. It's not, we say life of the well, it's actually our well, not as though the aquifer has played out.
No, that's understandable.
So, bottom line,
Yes.
Okay.
that's why the stainless steel, we have a chance
Yes.
of going 30 or 40 years
Should-
without having to
should
put
last
laterals.
So I guess what we're seeking now is just direction that first, if you agree with our first premise that we should stay in the well business.
Yes.
If there's, certainly some of the taste and odor issues would be resolved if you did not have that, but I do believe we can certainly minimize those with the new equipment that would come with the new well. And then it does provide the redundancy, but if we agree that we should stay in the well business, then it certainly would set us up in the 2018 budget to do the engineering, the design for that, to start seeking the funding from Texas Water Development Board. Hopefully we could get that low interest financing for that. And then in 2019, it would set us up for our debt sale. And then as the numbers we're throwing out to you today from a standpoint of the impact to rate, it gives us a little latitude on that because we're doing those, you know, rough, down and dirty. This is not our budget meetings. Janina and Jackie would certainly get the quotes from our bond counsel and from Texas Water Development Board as exactly what that debt service would be. We would crank that into our estimated consumption and give you exact figures at the budget, but that would then potentially be affecting us in October of 18 for fiscal year 2019. So,
I guess I do have one question, you know, as we go to build out in our city, I know we have, 5 million gallons overhead storage. Is that adequate as we go to build out?
Chris, from our water studies we've had, we have not had any indication that we need additional storage capacity.
No, we've had it looked at. We exceed, the state has a formula,
Right.
and so we exceed the formula. But beyond just exceeding a state minimum, when we do the hydraulic mapping of our system, we feel comfortable with that. TRA also has some storage, you remember the picture?
Yeah.
It's in Bedford, it's those ground storage tanks.
Mhm.
So when we do that study, we factor in a fifth of TRA's storage as being quote unquote ours. But I don't see that being an issue. What's real interesting right now is, obviously we have growth and development and all these things occurring, but our water number is not dramatically increasing. What I'm going to tell you is that's because there's been such a move towards conservation, whether it's water, our watering twice a week rules now, and even stage 2 watering, or just, building codes as far as, low flush toilets and different type of things. So they don't perfectly cancel each other out, but you're not seeing the amount of growth in the water system that you would have historically seen when you added population or development. It's
Is
somewhat.
that true in the other participating cities as well?
It is why, and when Fiona comes talk to y'all about TRA, she'll mention several times that they have shelved further expansion plans. Now, they continue to try to keep an eye on adjacent property. Remember, we were out there, they talked about the ability to maybe acquire some adjacent property. It's not that they don't think they would necessarily ever have to grow. It's just, we've already passed some time horizons that were identified years ago of planned expansion, and it's just, it hasn't been needed. So they talked about that when we were out there doing the tour, about what their capacities are and where we are at that, so.
But on the storage tank question, that isn't really the whole purpose of the tank is for pressure, right? I mean, isn't that the purpose of having a volume stored somewhere? So
Yes.
if you got pressure.
That helps your pressure. Now, I'll tell you, it's one of those other sites where we have the ground storage tank, there's no pressure, that's why we have the booster pumps. But it also does provide you, if TRA called us today and said, guys, we've got a big time emergency, we're gonna have to shut this plant down tonight, which they actually did about 2 years ago. They had a leak on the intake from Lake Arlington. They worked with all the cities, and the first thing we did was, we all filled our tanks from a pressure,
I see.
but we have the ability to put some pressure into it, but also just from a volume piece as well.
What's the total volume?
4, 5, 6,
2 days?
2 million, 2 million, 1 million, and then the 2 ground storage tanks.
2 average days.
Well, I'll tell you one average day.
That's right.
And on a day like today, that might be
Just
2 or 3 days worth. On an August day, it is morning's worth. Yeah.
A morning's worth.
But, I mean, in those kind of cases, I mean, we do have contingency plan. I mean, that becomes a communication thing.
Oh, yeah.
You're asking your residents to curtail water use. There's lots of things that you would do.
So we'll continue to work on this, but this will be a big piece of our upcoming budget, and,
So I'm assuming, go ahead.
So do you foresee, are you, stainless carbon, what are you foreseeing?
well, I would defer to Mr. Barker, because I said, Mr. Barker, why would we do stainless instead of carbon? But it is really the life of, it is the expected life, so.
It doesn't make
I don't think one is
the
better
water
than the
taste
other.
better or produce more water. I mean, it is how long it will last.
Right, and, you know, we could do the carbon, but we may not care, but 30 years from now, someone will probably be addressing the maintenance of it sooner than if they do the stainless, and so it really becomes a question of maintenance, long term, so.
Someone will be cursing us in 30 years.
If they would have just done the same, but for, if it is a fairly minimal cost differential, and the experts recommend that for that, we could get additional life out of that before you have to, it's because the well maintenance is very expensive, and, but, you know, the guarantees, I remember Gary McCamey saying out at his farm when he went to drill the well, he said it's extremely unnerving when you go to spend that kind of money and they give you no guarantees, but there really are no guarantees, so, I mean, that is obviously a worst case scenario that something happens and one doesn't produce, but as Chris said, in these 2 spots, we have a known well producing, and so it's not like, and that's why they were recommending at the 3rd spot, we would certainly do a test well before we would invest $4 million in a new well, and try to, with as much certainty as you can have, be sure that we would be able to have a working well.
Yeah, but I think warranty on the actual physical hardware assets of it, so that Hal's group's not having to now bring on an additional full-time employee. It seems like workload would go down because there's not as much maintenance to get a 50-year-old system
I
operating.
think we certainly would see less maintenance dollars. Our maintenance dollars have been much more considerable in the last few years as these wells have aged. And then certainly the SCADA system and automation and things like that, I think would certainly be better for the staff. So. Okay, well, this will lead us right into our next discussion, which is reclaimed water, which we're moving right along with, but there is, let's talk to you about that and the plan to try to finish that out.
I gotta tell you this one complete side note to the well deal, though, but I just find it amazing to me. When we had these wells pulled recently, because we're working on the Fuller well right now, it's out of service, the guy that did the draft report said, hey, this is such a great opportunity, the well's out, we need to do a deflection test to see
When I walk out.
You started drilling the well here on the ground, but 1,800 feet in the ground, is it truly vertical or how much did it move? Because that gets into where you can move your new well, right? Because you don't want to drill. So I guess I thought, I don't know, they started drilling a hole and it's just, I mean, it goes straight down, right? How hard can it be? And he said, no, you wouldn't believe how much, deflection that can occur. And so he was giving me all these average ranges. And when you think about when our wells were drilled in the 60s and then with the technology changes, he said, you just never know what you might find. He was completely blown away at the Fuller well. There's 14 feet of deflection in almost 2,000 feet of vertical, if you will. So he said, man, guys that drilled this well did a really good job back then. So anyway, I just think that's interesting.
Low and slow, brother, low and slow.
It's amazing. What's really neat is when they stick a tool down the top of that 16-inch shaft and go, 1,800 feet down the bottom and looking at a TV screen and they're trying to put a patch on.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like, wow, that's amazing. Reclaimed water. The picture up here on your left is changed a little bit over time, but this was the very first thing we showed you guys years ago where we envisioned a 6-phase project in which we extended the water line from the Riverwalk area where the pond and pump house is northward and provided water to what is primarily the multifamily community up that area, because if you remember, it was the low-hanging fruit to be able to switch their irrigation over to reclaimed water. There's a couple little things, Fountain Park HOA is identified there, and also the Tall Timbers Apartments. So this was kind of the original master plan. What we have completed just recently is would be basically phase 1, 2, and 3 of this project. So we've completed all of the stuff here in blue, generally all the stuff in yellow, and the purple. What we did not do is we did not do Tall Timbers Apartments because it simply did not financially money out to run the line that additional distance for what use that they had. Doesn't mean it'll never be there, it just meant it didn't make financial sense as part of the project. Same with Fountain Park HOA. This last piece picked up Village Green, but we didn't do that extra piece yet because it just financially right now does not money out. Doesn't mean that we're not going to come back and do that. So what is in your current CIP book are phases 4, 5, and 6, and they're layered in there over multiple years, and they've got a price of $4.3 million to do phases 4, 5, and 6. Phase 3 that we just completed, that we borrowed money from the Water Development Board, came in when it was all said and done under budget. And so we have visited with the Water Development Board since the bonds are already sold, and if you remember, we got some, what they call green fund, but I call it a grant. It's loan forgiveness. You borrowed X and then they just forgave so much of it right off the top money here. And we said, we are interested in using what they call the remaining unused funds for the next phase of the project. Can we do that? And they said, not only can you do that, we like you to do that. Because we've already gone through all the bond sales and everything, we'd like you just to apply it to the next phase of the project. So what we have asked them to do is, can we do that? And they've said yes. We need to design the next phase. And in fact, what we believe now is that we could roll phase 4, 5, and 6 into a single phase. We could complete the original 6-phase project with one more phase, do it at one time. We wanted to use an engineer, obviously, to do the design. I would like to use, if I could, the engineer that's done every other bit of the design, but we have to go through a process. Because we were using Water Development Board funds, we had to go back out through an RFQ process. We've done that, it's been advertised, and our staff is evaluating those, but our plan would be to bring you at your March 14th council meeting a action item that would authorize the city manager to enter into a professional services agreement for the design of the remaining 3 phases to be paid for with the remaining unused funds from phase 3. On top of that, there will be some additional unused money that we could roll to the construction of this, what I'm gonna call phase 4 now, but is really phase 4, 5, and 6 into one piece. Have not employed the engineer yet to do the design, but our current engineer has looked at what they believe a pretty loose opinion of probable cost would be, based on the fact that we just completed this, so we have really good numbers on what it costs to put in pipe. And the other thing we know is the pump station was built to hold 4 pumps, and the first 3 phases only necessitated the first 2 pumps. When we add phase 4, 5, and 6, it will necessitate adding the other 2 pumps so that the system runs at peak efficiency. And to be honest with you, we've been more successful than we originally anticipated on the Riverwalk development. Everything you see in the Riverwalk, HOA common areas, is irrigated with reclaimed water. And when I say we've been more successful, y'all will remember the zoning requires them to do that. It's really that Hovnanian has been much more successful.
You mean Lennar?
Lennar, I mean, I'm in the wrong place. They've sold the houses and built the houses faster than they thought. So we always kind of knew what the land mass would be, it's just come online faster. So this last phase, 4, 5, and 6 rolled into one, would finish the line all the way up there to the Mandolin Apartments, which basically is to Glade Road, and put in the other 2 pumps and the additional filter at the pump station, and complete what we originally envisioned, I guess with the exception there of Fountain Park HOA and Tall Timber. They would also take a look from an engineering standpoint of one of the little changes we made in this area is we actually extended this line to this point, and we actually brought it down to this point. There's been a plan to be able to extend this line all the way over to Midway Park, do our Blessing Branch piece, and also to tee off right here and hit that school district property. And I don't know, the other night at EDF, I don't know what Steve's gonna talk about, but he said they'd be coming to tell the city not too long about some school expansion plans. Obviously, they own that piece of property. I don't know if he's talking about that one, but someday that's also a right property for that. So they would finish up the study, if you will, for all of that. I believe everything I just talked about there can get done for about $3.9 million as opposed to the 4.3 that's currently in the CIP. I also think that number might be closer to about 3.1 or 3.2 because we're going to be able to deduct from that 3.9 the remaining unused funds that we talked about phase 3. So net, you're going to be talking, I think, about $3.1, $3.2 million. So our plan would be, if you agreed to, by March, I mean, like here in a couple days, we have to turn in that project information to the Water Development Board, in which they would again consider inviting us to apply for a water development loan. They have verbally indicated that they would really like to fund projects that they like this project, it's been good, it's on budget, it's been successful, it's got a green component, and so this is a continuation of it, so they would like to fund the next phase, so I think we would be hopefully successful. It would also hopefully be eligible for some additional green funding, which is just that loan forgiveness. Has the potential to reduce that 3.1 to 3.2 number I'm telling you, again, by several $100,000 if we got that part loan forgive. And then what we would do is work towards a bid of this in the September to October timeframe, so end of 17, first of FY18. We would time our debt sale, which again I'm saying is a Clean Water SRF fund, that's the Texas Water Development Board money, and bid award in October. Begin construction in the November to December timeframe, and we are anticipating about a 12-month construction. The alternative to that is we could take a pause and do nothing more. We could use the remaining unused funds to do all the engineering and design and then take a pause. When I say alternative, really the way I envision it is using these remaining unused funds to do the engineering and then being able to come back to you all for a decision point that says, now that the engineering's being done, this is the opinion of probable cost. Do you want to move forward with pursuing Water Development Board money? March 1st, I've got to turn in an application. It's not even an application for funding, it's the project information. That's not a decision point. If they choose to allow us to apply for funding, then we would come back to you all and say, do you want to apply for funding? Now we have the opinion of probable cost. Do you want us to apply for funding? That, as you might remember, takes a resolution and council action.
And this water, for comparison, is about $1.50. $1.55 per 1,000 gallons. So, again, there's a cost to the debt cell here, but any water that we are bringing from this source rather than TRA, we will be purchasing for the $1.55 rather than the $3.27. So, again, there is Janina will simply do the math on the debt cell and she'll determine, what that cost is. But then when we do the calculation of what we're purchasing, the water that will go to these users will be purchased at $1.55 rather than the $3.27.
And the savings will pay for the debt.
I hate to put it in those terms because what we do is we look at all of our debt costs and we look at all of our expenses, debt costs being one component of that.
Sure.
We look at how much water we're going to sell system-wide, and again, we blend those, we say we're purchasing this much from TRA, we're getting this much from our wells, we're getting this much from reclaimed water, and we come up with a blended cost of the water, and then we give our citizens, obviously, a blended rate. So everyone is benefiting from the lower cost of well water and the lower cost of reclaimed water. The reclaimed water is typically about 15% less than, we do pass on a little bit of the savings of that to the customer, but it is, they pay about 15% in general less than the potable water customer. So there's still some goodie going to the potable water customers from that. I hate to say it will result in a net wash because there is $3 million worth of debt here that we have to factor into the rate. The straight $3 million, I did the math on that the other day. If you just said how much is that, if you don't count out any savings from purchasing from TRA, that'd be about 15 cents per 1,000 gallons is what that would cost. But there is some savings from not having to buy that from TRA.
And then again, that's the business argument, and then you have the other part that I won't go back to, but y'all know about the idea of using reclaimed water instead of potable water is preserving our potable water source, be it well or TRA, for us in the future to drink.
It's currently all multifamily and common area for homeowner HOAs, and that's it? Is there any single family use of it?
Just from the standpoint of the HOA areas around the single-family homes. The issue with that is the state currently requires you to basically have not only a contract, but there's a maintenance plan and all these different things that you have to do, a person of authority, they gotta have certain educational training that we would provide. That is fairly easy done when you're talking about an HOA or a apartment management group or their landscape company. It is not easily done if you're talking about every single residence in a subdivision and then moving and changing. And so the bigger bang for your buck is to do those large common areas rather than just the front yard or
So
backyard.
is it fair to say will never be feasible to do it for single family?
In my mind, unless they change the regulations, it won't be feasible.
How about for city properties?
Okay, so yes, and what we have right now is up in this, basically in this pink area, if you think about the amphitheater dog park area, that's where it terminated, and so we're have converted our irrigation in those areas. Now, it's not, I don't want you to think it's that whole park, I mean, it's the part that we could reach from right there. And then in talking about this system, there are also the median irrigations along Bear Creek and even Mid-Cities and some of those that are irrigated. And then, of course, obviously, we're using the reclaimed water at Parks of Texas Star Softball World, this facility. But this part of the system, there are some city uses. This map doesn't show it because we didn't think we were gonna be able to, but Brookside HOA, we actually were able to hook up, and they've got some pretty extensive, HOA common areas that was hooked up. And then this is Riverwalk. This is a separate ownership, that hard corner that, I don't know, Loretta, it seems like we're talking to somebody all the time about development there. We, as part of bringing the line over to this piece, brought reclaimed water to those three pieces, so they're teed up to be ready to use, but there will be more of a commercial.
Is that the intention of going down the Blessing Branch Creek to make it to Midway Park?
That is the intention, to make it to Midway Park and be able to irrigate all that. And as you know, in the CIP plan, there's a project there that someday, Blessing Branch wouldn't turn into quote-unquote park. It's more of a trail to
Right.
link Riverwalk and that area of town over to the rec center,
Understood.
but allow you to irrigate all that as well.
So as we move forward, and we're able to get this system looped back to the west and get to Glade Parks and possibly get to other users on the west of us, are we 10 years out in planning for something like that?
Good question.
I think,
Yeah,
I
I think we gotta pause a little
would-
bit.
Yeah, I think we would pause. And we would, this was the original plan well, I guess the original plan was Texas Star and the parks at Texas Star. And then we had the ability to do this side of town, and there was, I guess what we would say is a lot of low-hanging fruit, because you had a lot of apartment complexes, heavy irrigation use, and some pretty straight paths to those. We will absolutely have to, at the conclusion of this project, stop and reassess whether or not it financially makes sense. One of the things that may make sense is as the airport starts to develop more of their property on the other side of 360, there may be some connection opportunities there that may make sense if they were to get some large uses on that side. When you start trying to make those runs all the way to Glade Parks, or when you try to get back to the other side of town, we're going to have to determine whether or not that will ever make economic sense to do that. It may not, because if you don't, because you can't pick up the individual residences unless you have very large users, and you're talking about some really long runs, that may not make sense. So.
The good part of it is, we've got parkland that goes all the way east-west to the city, right? So
Exactly.
there's no cost there from a
Right,
acquisition of land. You could run it through the parkland, you could pick up the park irrigation.
exactly.
The very expensive / bad part is that pond